All right, Shavuot, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Elul Haba Aleinu L'Tova Baruch Rena Dubin for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in honor of our children and all of the Suburban sons and daughters beginning their year of studying in Eretz Yisroel. May the Torah study and mitzvos in the Holy Land merit the release of our precious hostages, the success of our soldiers and return to their families, and the arrival of Moshiach, tzidkeuni, bimheira. Amen. So with that, let us begin. Today's daf is page Dalet 84. We are picking up on page Gimel Mabez 83b. Did we finish the Mishnah or did I leave off? I left off, right? Okay. So remember again, so let's just pick up on the two dots in the Mishnah again, which is 2, 4, 7 lines up from the bottom. Arba midos b'mochrin. So remember again, as I mentioned yesterday, there are really 4 different categories of sales the Mishnah is trying to explain to me. Right? So again, number 1 is a situation where the seller could void the transaction. Number 2, the buyer could void the transaction. Number 3, both can. Number 4, neither can. So the Gemara says, Arba midos b'mochrin. Machar lo chitin yafal sinim soros. So if let's say again, Reuven sold to Shimon, he was supposed to sell to Shimon good wheat, and it turned out that the wheat was inferior wheat. So what's the halacha in that case? The purchaser, right? The purchaser has the ability to void the sale, right? Because obviously, again, it's the purchaser who did not get what he wanted. Ro'os vinim tu yafos. What happens if they contracted to sell inferior wheat, and it turns out that Reuven sold superior wheat? So in that case, again, remember, it's the seller. Mocher yachol lachzer bo. Fine. Ro'os vinim tu ro'os, yafos vinim tu yafos. What happens if they contracted to buy inferior and it was inferior, or superior and it was superior? But let's say one of them has, wheat buyer's remorse, or wheat seller's remorse. In echamim yachol lachzer. Neither could renege. We'll say again, this is obvious because obviously in that case the transaction actually was what it was supposed to be. Shchomis or shechumsis. The nim says lavana. We're going to see shechumsis means red wheat, but it turned out to be white wheat. Or Levana Benim says Shchamsis, or again it was white wheat, it turned out to be red wheat. Eitzim Shal Zayis V'Nimtzu Shal Shikma, or Reuven, they contracted that Reuven is going to sell Shimon, olive wood, but it turned out to be sycamore wood. Shal Shikma V'Nimtzu Zayis, or sycamore wood, and it turned out to be olive wood. Yayin V'Nimtzu Chometz, or they contracted to sell wine, but it turned out to be vinegar. Chometz V'Nimtzu Yayin, or vinegar, and it turned out to be wine. So I will say Shneihem Yecholin Lachzor Bahem. Both cases, in this case, both parties could renege. Now, I will say, what's interesting about these last cases over here, of red wheat that was supposed to be white, right, or white wheat that was supposed to be red, olive wood that was supposed to be sycamore wood, or vice versa, or wine and vinegar. In these cases, both items have value. They have value. They just have different value to different people. You see, whereas in the previous cases, it was clear that someone was put at a disadvantage, right? Reuven agreed to sell Shimon superior wheat and he sold him inferior wheat, or vice versa, right? So remember again, in that case, someone was put at a disadvantage, and therefore the person who was put at a disadvantage has the right to void the sale. In these latter cases, there's no particular clear disadvantage. There's just 2 dissimilar items, but both valuable in their own way. We're going to see even wine and vinegar, I will say. Even wine and vinegar, we often think it's just vinegar as the spoiled cousin of wine, right? But Lamaisa vinegar has its own value. So in these cases over here where both of the items have a value, but again, maybe the parties did not get exactly what they wanted, both parties have the ability to void the sale. Okay, let's analyze. It says in Amar Rav Chisda. So some interesting applications of this idea. So Rav Chisda, Machalo Shava Chamish B'Sheish. So let's listen to this. Reuven sold Shimon an item worth 5 zuz, and then what happened? He sold it for 6 zuz. So we'll say we call that Ona. Ona, right? He overcharged. Again, remember, we're not getting to remember again back to our Ezu Neshech days. There's a whole discussion exactly how you measure Ona, right? Milagav, milabar, how exactly do you calculate the 6? Well, we're not going to get into that now. We already did that sugya. But in any event, what happens? So he sold him an item worth 5 zuz, we'll call it, but he charged him 6. V'hukar v'amad al shmonim. Now the item appreciated, and now it's actually worth 8 zuz. So what's the halacha? Minis ana. So who is the victim of Ona? Lokeach. Because obviously, again, in this case, Reuven sold the item to Shimon. Shimon overpaid by a 6th, and therefore, again, Shimon is the victim of Ona. Okay? Therefore, because he is Lokeach Yachal Lachzerbo. So obviously, in this kind of case, because it is the purchaser who was overcharged and is quote-unquote the victim of Onah, therefore the purchaser has the ability to go ahead and void the transaction. Also remember again how it works by Onah. Less than a sixth is negligible and forgiven. A sixth is the sale stands, but it's voidable. It's voidable. And more than a sixth, the transaction is voided. So in this case over here, the overcharging was exactly by a sixth. So therefore, again, it was in this case the purchaser who was impacted, and therefore he has the right to void the sale. So lokeach yochel lachzer bo v'lo mocher, but the seller doesn't have the ability to void it, right? Mishum, why is that? Mishum da'amarle, because the purchaser could always say to the seller, top of $84A, ilu lo onisan lo hava masas hadris b'cha. So remember again, the seller could say to the buyer could say to the seller, listen seller, had you not overcharged me, you would have had no right to go ahead and void the transaction. Right? You would have had no right to void the transaction. Because at the end of the transaction would have stood. Hashta da'onisan masas hadris bi. So now that you overcharged me, and I, the purchaser, and the victim of Onah, you, the seller, should have the right to void the sale? It doesn't make any sense. In other words, we'll say, had there been no Onah, so again, let's go through this again. Reuven sold Shimon, let's just call it wheat. Reuven sold Shimon wheat, and it was worth 5 zuz. He sold it to him for 6 zuz. Overcharged him by a 6. Therefore, Shimon, the purchaser, has a right to void the sale. But Reuven does not have a right to void the sale. Right? What's the logic? Because Shimon could say to Reuven, what rights do you have? Had you not overcharged me, you would have had no right to void the sale. So now that you overcharged me, you should have the right to void the sale. It doesn't make any sense. The only party who has the right to void the sale is the impacted purchaser. Again, not a chiddush of Osir. The Gemara is going to ask this. Rav Chisda doesn't really seem to be any type of chiddush over here. Vitana tuna, and our Mishnah supports this because what did the Mishnah say? Yafos v'nim suraos. If Reuven was contracted to sell Shimon good wheat, but he sold him inferior wheat, lokeach yochar lachzer bo v'lo mocher. So the purchaser has the ability to void the transaction, but not the seller. Okay, next case. So we'll say now this is the reverse case. Reuven sold Shimon, we'll still call it wheat, right? Reuven sold Shimon wheat, and it was worth 6 zuz, but he sold it to him for 5 zuz, so he undersold it. And now what happens? It went ahead and it depreciated even more, and now it's only worth 3 zuz. Minisana, so we'll say who is the victim of Onah in this case? The mocher, seller, right? The seller mistakenly undersold it. He undersold it. So therefore, in this case, again, the mocher is the quote-unquote the victim. Victim is a strong word, but you understand, he is the one impacted by the onah. And therefore, again, mocher yachol lachzer bar. Because remember again, onah goes both ways. It goes to overcharging and undercharging. So whoever is impacted by the overcharging or undercharging is the one who could void the sale based on onah. Okay, so in this case over here, Reuven sold to Shimon. Reuven botched the sale and he undersold it. So therefore, again, because he undersold it, Reuven has the ability to go ahead and claim onah. But not the purchaser, but not Shimon. Because why? Because what could Reuven say to Shimon? Reuven can say to Shimon, had I not undercharged you, right, you would have had no recourse. You couldn't void the sale because once the sale is done, it's done. The Gemara says, and now that I am the victim of onah, you, the purchaser, should have the right to void it. Doesn't make any sense. Tana Tuna, and the Mishnah supports this. So I just want to point out, all Rav Chisda is coming to teach us. He's defining cases of onah. He's saying whoever is impacted by onah is the one who has the right to void the sale, and the one not impacted by the onah doesn't have the right to void the sale. That's Rav Chisda's entire premise. Our Mishnah supports this idea. Ra'os v'nimtzas yafos. If Reuven contracted with Shimon to sell him inferior wheat, and it turned out to be superior wheat, so Reuven made a mistake. Mocher yachol lachzer bo. Reuven, the seller, has the ability to renege. V'lo lokeach, but not Shimon, the purchaser. So the Gemara says, okay, and we'll say, so in all of this, my kamash on Rav Chisda, shkoyach, thank you for the chazara, but what are you teaching us? Masnisin he. Again, it's a Mishnah. Or I will say, again, these halachos are obvious. First of all, this is literally the case of the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah said again, Reuven contracted to sell Shimon X. If, again, it turned out to be Y, if the Y puts Ruvain at a disadvantage, then Ruvain could void the sale. If Y puts Shimon at a disadvantage, Shimon could void the sale. So that's the Mishnah. So what is Rav Chisda teaching us? So we'll say it's very interesting. The Gemara says, "Ma'ika mashmalon masnisin." The Gemara says, "Ma'ika mashmalon masnisini." What is Rav Chisda teaching us? Everything Rav Chisda told us ultimately again is a Mishnah. So this is actually interesting. Im masnisin hava amina dilma de Rav Chisda tarvaihu masi hajibuhu. So Rabbi said, this is interesting. If just in the Mishnah, I would have thought, and Rabbi said, what's Rav Chisda's case? What's Rav Chisda's case? Rav Chisda's case is a case of ono. So remember, our Mishnah is not really ono, right? Our Mishnah is not ono. Our Mishnah is that the item promised is not the item delivered, right? So our Mishnah really is a little bit more almost of like mekachtos or something like that. So this is actually very interesting. Rav Chisda's case is ono. I would have thought about like this. What happens in a case of ono? What happens in the case of ono? Maybe the way we view the transaction is almost as if it's like in suspended animation. Like in other words, the transaction is frozen, right? Because we don't know what's going to happen. So because in an ono case, the transaction is kind of just floating, maybe either party has the ability to cancel it, right? Which by the way, would be an interesting svara. Because when you have ono, the transaction has not fully solidified. Remember again, less than a sixth, negligible, forgiven. More than a sixth, pretty much automatically voided. But at that sixth range, so again, at that range, really it's voidable. So maybe because it's voidable, the transaction never really kind of like dropped. It never dropped, it never settled. Because it never settled, either party has the ability to go ahead and void it. So Gemara says, right? Both have the ability to go ahead and negate it. And maybe what our Mishnah comes to teach us is that that a purchaser has the ability to go ahead and negate this. Maybe our Mishnah is really coming to teach us, I will say, that a purchaser has the ability to go ahead and negate a sale. Now, why do you need the Mishnah to teach you that a purchaser has that ability to negate a sale? This is very interesting. So we'll say, listen to this. The Mishnah says, now it's quoting over here from Mishlei, Ra Yomer HaKona, bad, says the purchaser. So we'll say the Rashbam explains this, and we'll see it inside in just a moment, but this is really very interesting. In general, the way it works in transactions is what happens. The seller, right? What do sellers do? Sellers are always going to make their product look better than what it is. Right? That's what sellers do. They hype up their product. This is the best thing in the world. Even though what? It's not. Now again, not lying, not deception, but again, just building up. What do buyers normally do? Buyers normally like to diminish the value of the item that they're buying in order to go ahead and get a better deal. Right? That's the pasuk is that Ra Yomer HaKona, that literally again the purchaser says, this is not so great. Whatever, I'll take it off your hands. If fine, I feel bad for you. I'll do you a tova. But the item is not really so great. So let's just listen to this. I would have thought maybe that a purchaser can never really go ahead and claim mekachtos, since it's always he accepts the fact that whatever he's getting from the purchaser is never going to be as good as the purchaser says it is. Right? Interesting, right? Then maybe this is just built into transactional law. So understand, Reuben says to Shimon, I'm selling you mamish, the best wheat that the Ribbon Shalom ever created in this great world. It's the best wheat since Adam and Chava ate wheat in Gan Eden. It's absolutely incredible. It's great. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. And meanwhile, every single purchaser should know that what? It's probably been on the day-old shelf, for a little while or whatever it is. So I would think maybe that's baked into transactional law, and therefore maybe the purchaser can't really claim mekachos. Kamashon, the Mishnah says, no. If someone tells you they're selling you X, you have every right to expect that you're receiving X. And if you don't receive X, then you have the right to void the transaction. So it's interesting. So the Gemara is just pointing out that Rav Chisda and the Mishnah really talk about two things. From Rav Chisda, I would have thought that because it's ono, and maybe since the transaction never fully dropped, maybe both parties have the ability to void it. Now, Kamashlan, that is not the case. Kamashlan, in an ono situation, who has the ability to void it? Only the impacted party. The Chiddush of the Mishnah is that even a purchaser has the ability to avoid a transaction. And we don't say that every purchaser should always understand that whatever the seller is giving him, he's never going to receive something as good as what the seller is giving him, because that's what sellers do. They pump up their product to make it look much better than it is. Kamash will know that as a purchaser, I have a right to believe that what I'm being promised is going to be delivered. And if it's not as it was promised, then I have the ability to avoid the transaction. If you look at the Rashbam actually has, you see the Rashbam that says Umas Nisin. It's about the Rashbam begins 2, 4, 6, about 7 lines up from before it gets wide, but that's not where we're starting. If you go into the wide lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines into the wide lines, the middle of the line, the li nira. This is where the Rashan gives his interpretation. The li nira, the hachi matzi tayile. So again, you might have thought from the Mishnah that what? That a seller can say, listen, I told you that I was selling you good wheat, and now you're claiming it's inferior wheat. So the seller would say, I didn't deceive you. Chas v'shalom, I didn't deceive you. This is good stuff. The tov yomer hamocha b'shas nechira. Right? Again, every seller says that he's selling the best product. He's selling the best product. Avagabe onosh sus Rav Chisda she'ein adam yodeh shavyav shel nekach ad shir letagar hasam leka lemei ra yomer akona v'yodeh shayakona b'yoker tiav yodeh. Fine. So both say therefore the Rashbam explains this distinction. Therefore, again, ultimately, Rav Chisda and the Mishnah are really teaching two separate halachas. Okay, so what we emerged from over here is number one, by Ona, which we've already known, by Ona, even though one could make the argument that the transaction is kind of in suspended animation until we know what the impacted party wants to do, but it is only the impacted party who has the right to cancel the transaction. The non-impacted party does not have the right to cancel, even though the transaction really hasn't fully settled. That's the halacha b'ayona. And what the Mishnah is coming to teach us is that even though it's understood in the marketplace that every single seller builds up his product, so you might have thought, therefore, again, really a purchaser can't claim that he didn't get what he ordered, because he should understand you're never fully getting what you ordered. Kamash will know when someone makes a promise that when you agree to receive product A, you have every right to go ahead and receive product A as it was described and as it was expected. And if it does not conform to those realities, you have the right to cancel the transaction. Incredible. Let's go back there. Shchamis v'nim seis levanim. So what's a beautiful Gemara over here? So remember again, now one of the examples, so that was in the first part of the Mishnah. In the second part of the Mishnah were these other cases where you contracted to buy something and you got something different. But it's not clear that the different item is inferior. It's just different. So, for example, Ruvain agreed to go ahead and sell Shimon red wheat, and it turned out to be white wheat. Okay, different types of wheat. So what's the halach over there? What does the Mishnah say? Both parties have the ability to cancel. Because in this case, again, in this situation, there's not a good and a bad, there's just different. It's just different. So in that case over here, both parties have the right to cancel the transaction. So the Gemara just says, by the way, just as an aside, Amar Papa, Midiktani Lavana, Shma Mina Hai Shimsha Sum Kasihi. So what's interesting? So the Gemara says, look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Midiktani Lavana Shma Mina, the Rashbam, Shamchasis Aduma Velo Shchora, Dashne Maros Hish Bechitin Velo Yoser, Lavanos Aduma. So apparently in the world of wheat, there are two colors of wheat. There's white wheat and there's red wheat. Two colors of wheat. So here's what's interesting. So now, Bosai, when I look in the Mishnah and I see shechamis wheat, I'm not sure what. Now, shechamis, so chum could either be like dark, like black, or it can, but there's probably one problem. There's no such thing as black wheat. No such thing as black wheat. So therefore, shechamis has to mean what? Red. So look at the Rashbam. He says, "B'ditani levana shchamis aduma v'lo shchora." Right. So shchamis has to be red and not black. Dahashnim maros yesh bechitin v'lo yoser. There's only two shades of wheat. There's red and there's white. Levanos adumos. Umidikari lechada levana uleida shchamis. So for calling one of them, so levana is white, and for calling the other one shchamis, shmamina shchamis aduma. It must be that shchamis is red. Now, how does shchamis mean red? V'al shem chama. So within the name Shchamis is Chama, Shehi Aduma, Kar Lechitin Aduma Shchamsis. Okay, so I understand. You're thinking, all right, not the most riveting piece of Gemara I've ever learned. But watch how beautiful this is. So go back to the Gemara now for just a moment. Amar Papa. Midiktani Levana, Shvamina Hai Shimsh. So now again, so just to follow the train of thought, right? Mishnah tells that two types of wheat, Shchamis and Levana. Levana I know is white. Shchamis, I thought maybe it means black, but it can't mean black because there's no such thing as black wheat. So therefore, again, I know the only other type of wheat is red, which means Shchamis must mean red. So why? So the root of Shchamis is Chama. Chama means sun. Chama means sun. So the Gemara says, by the way, what do you see from here? Shmamina Hai Shimsha Sumkasihi. See from here that the real color of the sun is red. The real color of the sun is red. So the Gemara is saying, now, this is incredible. So why? The fact that we call red wheat Shchamis means that Chama, which comes from the word Chama, red, must mean that the sun in its essence is red. The Gemara says the truth is we know this. How do we know this? Teda, the Kasamka Tzafra Upanya. The sun is red in the morning and in the evening, right? When it's rising, you see its redness. And when it's setting, ultimately, again, you see its redness. So why does it not appear red the entire day? So why don't we see its redness the entire day? So the Gemara says, Nahorin hu delo bari. It's because ultimately, again, the light. So listen to this. Look at the Rashbam. The Horid Lobari, Ma'ar Einenu Enubar. Our eyesight is not strong enough. Kol kach mitoch arayom. So because again, see, here's the difference. In the morning and in the evening, the real color of the sun is apparent because it's set against the darkness of the sky. By day, when it's light, the real color of the sun is not truly apparent. So in other words, we tend to think of the sun as yellow, right? Because that's the color that we see it with during the dominant part of the day. It's not really yellow, just in the backdrop of the lightness of the sky, it's yellow, but the true color of the sun could be seen against a backdrop of darkness. Red and, right, which in the morning and the evening, which is red. I've just finished up that ashram. Aval safa upanya shayom choshet. But in the morning and the evening, where the sky is dark, nikar admumis hachamo. Ultimately, then you could really see the redness of the sun. By the way, this whole thing, Rav Papa is just trying to explain why the Mishnah calls red wheat shchamis. Okay, so we'll say a really beautiful Gemara. Also, we'll say something really beautiful about this idea that the sun, right? If you think about it again, the sun represents consistency. There's between the sun and the moon. Right, the moon waxes and wanes. The moon is not consistent, but the sun is consistent. So I will say it's quite beautiful if you think about this. But when's the only time that you see the actual color of the sun? In the backdrop to darkness. The true test of consistency is during the dark times in life. Right? That's really, in other words, it's easy to be consistent when everything is going fine. The question is, when life becomes challenging, circumstances become challenging, do I keep my regilus? Do I keep my consistency? The true color of the sun, the true color of consistency is only seen against the backdrop of darkness. Darkness almost always a metaphor for adversity and difficulty. True metal of one's consistency comes during challenging periods of life. Incredible Gemara, but we're not finished. Meisvei, the Gemara says, 1 second, let's ask a kasha. Umareo amok mina'ar. So we'll say this is saras. Now remember again, saras is white. Saras is white. Generally, saras is white. And the way the pasuk, it's interesting that the way the pasuk describes saras is that saras looks amok. Amok literally means what? Deeper. Armarea amok min ha'ar. Rash says over here, halavan nira amok eitzal shachar. So the white looks, so to speak, deeper against the backdrop of the darkness. So the Gemara says, kimare chama amuka min hatzel. The way that ultimately, again, the sun looks deeper than the shade. Again, let's say the idea over here is that when you put the sun against the darker background, the sun itself seems like it shines a bit more. Now, what's the whole over here? Now, if you notice, by the way, v'hasam lavanu. Here, the Gemara is comparing tsaras to the sun. Now, tsaras is white. So now the Gemara seems to be indicating that the sun, its true color, is white as well. That contradicts what we just said before, because before we just said that the sun is red. To which the Gemara says, this is very interesting, Kimarachama velo kimarachama. The truth is, Saras is like the appearance of the sun, and it's not like the appearance of the sun. How so? Kimarachama da'amuka minatzel. On one hand, it's like the sun, because just like the sun appears as a deeper color against a darker backdrop, so too Saras appears like a deeper color against the darker backdrop of healthy flesh. V'lo kimarachama, but on the other hand, Saras is not like the sun. How so? The ilu hasam lavan v'hacha adom. Saras is white, and ultimately again, the sun is red. So the Gemara says, Ulamai desalik daita meikara, ha-kasam katsafro panya. So we'll say, here's the issue. So we'll say, this is fascinating. So the Gemara says, okay, so we reconciled it. But here's what's interesting to note. The havamin of the Gemara was that the sun was white. Right? In other words, just follow the progression, right? Rav Papa said the sun is red. How do you know the sun is red? Because the Mishnah calls red wheat shchamis. Shchamis. Why is red called shchamis? From Lashon of Chama, the sun. The sun is red. The sun is red. And the truth is, Rav Papa's proof to that is what? What's Rav Papa's proof? What's Rav Papa's proof? Morning and evening. In the morning and the evening, the sun looks red. Then the Gemara brings a kasha. And the kasha is, it compares Saras to the sun. Saras is white. So that means the sun is white. To which the Gemara says, no. The comparison means that, again, compares Saras to the sun in different ways. The Gemara says, okay, so let's go back for a second. But obviously, if you ask the kasha from Saras, then the havamina is that the sun is white. But how can you even have a havamina that the sun is white? Look at the color of the sun in the morning and in the evening. So if the sun is really white, how do you explain the redness of the sun in the morning and the evening? Abba said, get ready. Hold on to your coffee. Listen to this. The Gemara says this is incredible. How can you have a havamina that the sun is white? Look at the shade of the sun in the morning and the evening. It's red. Get ready. In the morning, the sun passes by the rose garden of Gan Eden. And it's the color of the rose garden of Gan Eden that gives the white sun its coloration. Bepanya, the chalfa pischa de Gehenim. In the evening, the sun passes by the entranceway of Gehenim. And it's the redness of the fires of Gehenim that give it its color. Others say, no, it's the opposite. In the morning, it passes by the fires of Gehenim, and towards the evening, it passes by the rose garden of Gan Eden. So Rabbi say, so therefore, again, it would appear that Lamaisa, there is a machlokes as to what color is the sun. Is the sun in its essence color naturally red, and it's only by day that we can't see the true redness because of the backdrop to the light? Or maybe the sun is naturally white, and ultimately, again, what we see in the morning and in the evening is actually just a reflection of the rose garden of Gan Eden and the fires of Gehenna. So also, just point out in this Gemara, there's something so incredibly profound and beautiful over here. Right? How does the sun start? So remember again, the sun starts at the entranceway of Gan Eden, right, and ends at the entranceway of Gehenna. Or other opinion says, no, it starts at the entranceway of Gehenna and ultimately again goes to Gan Eden. So we'll say, so remember again, the rising and setting of the sun is the metaphor for human life, is the metaphor, right? Hashemesh Zorech Uba Pasuk in Kohelas. Okay, it'll come to me. Again, Shalom Melech refers ultimately again to life, as the sun rising, the sun setting. The sun rising, sun setting. Shabbos said, is an incredible metaphor that every single day I start my day and I have the ability to make this day Gan Eden. I have the ability to make it Gan Eden. I can, right? That's where the sun starts. The sun is colored by literally the rose garden of Gan Eden. So if I want, I could make today Gan Eden. Do you know what the tragedy of the human condition is? Tragedy of the human condition is so often I mess it up and I make it Gehenna. So a day that started, that could have been Gan Eden, because of a series of missteps and mistakes, it ends up setting in Gehenna. And I both say, no, we could all relate to this. Days that started with so much promise, so much beauty, so much potential, and then mamish, I messed it up. I made it into Gehenna. But the converse is also true. That you could have a day that begins in Gehenna, and with enough effort, and with enough koach, and with enough foresight, and with enough vigilance, you could turn Gehenna into Gan Eden. It's just a question of how hard you're willing to work. I could take Gan Eden and I could turn it into Gehenna. That's easy. That's easy. I could do that with my eyes closed, right? I could take Gan Eden and turn it into Gehenna with absolutely no effort. Give me 5 minutes. Give me 5 minutes. And I could turn Gan Eden into Gehenna. But I could also turn Gehenna into Gan Eden. As I could do that also, it takes a lot more work. It takes a lot more effort. There's a beautiful insight. Rav Zuckerman, who was the Rav Avram Zuckerman, Zecher Tzaddik Lebracha, was the founder of Yeshivos Bnei Akiva, the Bnei Akiva Yeshiva system. Quotes the Medrash that says that when Noach sent the dove, right? So the dove came back with the olive branch. So the Medrash brings down that olive branch was from Gan Eden. Found, right? Gan Eden was the only area not impacted by the Mabul. He was brought back the olive branch. So Zuckerman says so beautifully that what the dove was trying to teach Noach was man took a world that was Gan Eden and he turned it into Gehenna. But he brought him back the olive branch to say, Noach, if you want to, you could take Gehenna and you could rebuild it into Gan Eden. That was the symbolism of that olive branch from Gan Eden. We'll say, we take great things and we mess it up terribly. But we could also take messed up things and build them back beautifully. That wasn't a political statement, but you understand, right? You know, right? You could build them better, right? You could build it better, right? You could beautifully better, right? You could go and say that's our avoda, and it's so incredible. And every single day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts into creation this ability. The same sun that starts in Gan Eden goes to Gehenna. I could do that all the time. But the same sun that starts in Gehenna and goes to Gan Eden, if the sun could do it, if the sun could make the journey from Gehenna to Gan Eden, I certainly can as well. Incredible. All right, let's go weiter. Yayin. So again, Reuven sold Shimon wine, right? He was supposed to sell wine. It turned out to be vinegar. So both of them could renege. Now we'll say, the whole chap over here is that both of these items are of value. And therefore, again, this is not the same thing as superior wheat, inferior wheat. Our Mishnah must reflect the view of Rabbi not Rabbanon. This Sanya, because also we learned on the days, Yain b'chometz minecharu. So, right, wine and vinegar are one entity. One entity. Now, both say, actually, what this is referring to over here is truma. That again, saloch l'mayis, again, you could take truma from wine on vinegar and from vinegar on wine. They're considered to be one thing. Rabbi Omer Shnei Minin. Rabbi says, no, they're two separate things. Shabbos says, so the fact that Rabbi says that they're two separate things, that's why, again, if Reuven agrees to sell Shimon wine, he sells them vinegar, both have the ability to go out and renege on the contract, because again, just what was promised simply was not delivered. And this is not even an issue, again, of superior, inferior. This is just an issue of you delivered the wrong product. Shabbos says, so again, fine. The Gemara says, no, if you look at Rabbanon, the truth is our Mishnah can reflect the view of the Rabbanon. How so? Remember again, really in this case, the Rabbanon are only arguing on Rebbe in terms of tithing. That the Rabbanon hold that for tithing purposes, wine and vinegar are considered to be the same thing. However, again, because this has to do with a different tithing issue. Rabbi Eloi says like this. Now let's say, how do you know that if you tithed superior produce from inferior produce, that the tithing still works? Right? In other words, I have good produce, bad produce. So ideally, of course, I should tithe from my good produce. But how do I know that if I tithed from my bad produce on the good stuff, it still works? So behind the Gemara, so where do I know this from? Shenemar v'lo tisu alav chait barem chemes chalbo mimeno. Shabbos said, this is very interesting. Listen, so the pasuk says as follows. Literally translated, you will not have to bear the sin as long as you separate the best of the produce as your tithe. Okay? So the Gemara says, Shabbos says, what that seems to indicate is, as long as I go and I set aside the best of my produce, as Trumas and Maestras, there'll be no chait. So the Gemara says, Im Eino Kadosh, Shabbos say, now, what do you infer from that? What you infer from that is, if I separated inferior produce, then what? There is a sin. But not only is there a sin, but it works. Why? Because if it didn't work, then what? There wouldn't be a sin. Because if it didn't work, it wouldn't be designated as Trumas HaMaasros. If it's not Trumas HaMaasros, then there's no sin. In other words, the fact that the Torah says, if you designate the best produce as your Trumas and Maasros, you will not bear any iniquity, you will not bear any sin. Right? Which tells me that if I separated the inferior produce, I've committed a sin, but the designation still works. Designation still works. So the Gemara says, Im Eino Kadosh, if it didn't work to designate inferior produce, Chet Lama. So then why would there be any sin? So the Rabbanan say, this is from here you see that although ideally you should not designate inferior produce as Trumas HaMaasros on superior produce, if you did so, it works. It works. However, but the Rabbanan will say, that's a din by Trumas HaMaasros. So by Trumas HaMaasros, the halacha is if you designate inferior produce for superior produce, it works. So therefore, we'll say, watch how this plays out. According to the Rabbanan, I have wine. If I separate out Trumas HaMaasros from vinegar on my wine, the Rabbanan say it works. It works. Why? Because vinegar is the inferior cousin of wine. And the Rabbanan Rabbi Eliyahu says that although you should not do it, if you designated inferior produce as Trumas HaMaasros for superior produce, it works. Aval, I'll say, but by Mekach Umemkar, by transactional law, of course, even the Rabbanan will agree with the statement of the Mishnah. We'll say, if Reuven agrees to sell Shimon wine and he sells him vinegar, no one is going to say that transaction stands. Right? Why? Two dissimilar products with two different uses. So everyone is going. So we'll say. So essentially, what the Gemara is saying is everyone agrees with the statement of the Mishnah. Everyone agrees that if Reuven agreed to sell Shimon wine and he sells him vinegar, or vinegar and he sells him wine, both parties have the ability to renege. Why? Because the transaction was not satisfied. The agreement was not satisfied according to all opinions. Right? It simply does not work, and everyone agrees with that. There's a machlokes by Trumas HaMaasros, right? Rebbe says you can't tithe wine from vinegar or vinegar from wine because they're two different things. The Rabbanan say you can, but that's for a totally separate halacha. Because the Rabbanan say if you tithe superior produce from inferior produce, it works based on the drush on the pasuk. But by Mekach Umemkar, all agree. You agree to sell wine, you deliver vinegar. You disagree to sell vinegar, you deliver wine. Everyone agrees that is a avoidable transaction by either of the parties. Incredible. Beautiful. Mishnah. Let's go. Hamocher peres lechavero. So Reuven sells produce to his friend. Moshiach v'lo madad kana. So if Shimon did Moshiach, Shimon did Moshiach, he took possession of the produce, even if he did not measure the produce that Reuven was selling to him. Halacha l'maaseh, the transaction is settled. Look at the Rashban for just a moment. So remember again, the price has been settled. So it's interestingly enough, apparently, like when you would buy produce, it would be common to go ahead and obviously you're paying the money, you're taking possession, and then you would measure it. You would do your own measure, do your own count. What the Mishnah is highlighting to us is that halacha l'maaseh, if Reuven sold Shimon, a pound, 3 pounds of apples, right? Then l'maaseh, again, after Shimon takes possession of it, even if he did not measure it, the transaction is settled. In other words, that measuring is not ma'akev. Okay. Madad v'lo mashach lo kana. What happens if Shimon took possession of the apples and he measured it, but he did not do Moshiach, right? So in other words, he's counting it out, but he did not do Moshiach. And I remember again, what does Moshiach require? Pulling it into your reshus, right? Bringing it into your reshus. So in this, we'll discuss how all this happens. So let's say again, you can imagine for a moment they're standing on Reuven's property. Reuven says, here's the 3 pounds of apples. And while on the property, Shimon begins to measure out the apples. Shimon has not acquired it. In other words, measuring does not affect acquisition. Measuring does not affect acquisition. So madad v'lo mashach lo kana. Em haya pikeach. Now again, so if Shimon was a smart guy, what would he do? Sochers makoman. He would rent a small part of Shimon's field. So now let's remember again, all of this is happening in Shimon's field, let's assume. So obviously again, Reuven's field. Reuven's selling Shimon apples. So what did we say? if Shimon does Mashiach, he pulls it into his property, even if he did not measure it, he's acquired it. But let's say Shimon is standing on Reuben's field, and Shimon is measuring out the apples. He's counting out the apples. He does not acquire it. Now, what could Shimon do if he wants to acquire the apples right here and now? He could rent some space from Reuben, right? If he rents the space, or let's say he's measuring the apples right now, then ultimately, if he owns the land, then what? He'll acquire the produce. How does he acquire the produce? Kinyan Chatzar. Halokeach pishna mechavero. If you acquire flax from your friend, you don't acquire it until literally again you move it from place to place. And we'll say now what the Rashbam points out over here, what this really means is hagbah. Right? So if you want to acquire flax, the only way to acquire flax is hagbah, you have to lift it up. Now, the lashon is until you carry it from one location to another. The truth is, by hagbah, you actually don't have to carry it from one location to another. What do you have to do? You have to lift it up. Just the normal derech of people is, once you're lifting something up, often you're carrying it from one place to another. Fine. But if the flax was attached to the ground, and you detached it in any amount, kana. So the act of detachment also affects acquisition. Again, we'll define in the Gemara how all of these different kinyanim work. Says the Gemara, Am Rabbi Yochanan. Madad v'niach hagabe simta kana. So let's remember again the simta. We spoke about the simta a little bit. You have, remember again, Rosh Hashanah. And again, Rosh Hashanah, public thoroughfare. After Rosh Hashanah, you often would have a simta. A simta is what we'll call, it's not really an alleyway, but what it is it's an area kind of off to the side of the Rosh Hashanah where people would often go in to conduct business. You need a little bit of quiet from the hustle and bustle of the Rosh Hashanah. You'd come into the simta, right? And in the simta, it was common for people to put down their utensils. So the simta, when you're there, almost has the quasi-identity of a Rosh Hashanah. Simta has the ability almost like to become like your own domain. So Rabbi listen to this. This is very interesting. So Rabbi Yochanan. So remember again, we'll say, we spoke about the idea in the Mishnah that measuring produce does not affect acquisition. Rabbi says in Rabbi Yochanan, what happens if this is happening in a simta? Right? So Reuben is selling Shimon 3 pounds of apples. Shimon begins to go ahead and measure the apples in a simta. Rabasi says, kana. Ultimately, again, you acquire it. Now, why? What's the logic? Take a look at the Rashbam, about 5 or 6 lines up from before it gets wide. Halokeach kilu hinicham bocher b'shuso shalokeach v'shapasak adamim. The simta, so we'll say why. A simta has the ability to act as private domain. So essentially, when Reuven brings that produce into the simta and Shimon's there, and Shimon's measuring it there, it's almost as if the simta becomes the domain of Shimon, and therefore he's able to acquire the apples. Rabbi Zera comes along and says, maybe that case only is talking about a situation where Shimon is measuring it and putting it into his utensil. In other words, if it's just going on the ground of the simta, Shimon can't acquire it. But maybe if Shimon is going ahead and putting it into his utensil, that's when he can acquire it. All right, we'll stop over here for today. Leaving a little bit of a cliffhanger. Machlokes Rabbi Yassi, Rabbi Zera. To be continued tomorrow. Shkoyach.